Excellent. So I see some people coming into the Zoom room. Hello, welcome everyone. We'll give it just a few moments for everyone to get settled. If you're joining us right after dinner, maybe grab a coffee, some tea, get cozy, get comfortable. We have a really great community conversation for you this evening with some amazing panelists. Welcome everyone. My name is Sophie Hinch. I'm the Education and Public Programs Coordinator at the Art Gallery of Windsor. And we're so glad that you're here this evening with us at Does Surveillance Equal Safety? A community conversation. So just before we get started, we are going to run through our table of contents or our agenda for the evening so you know what to expect and you know what's going on. We'll start first off with our land acknowledgement, followed by our pillar of creating conversation. We'll introduce our moderator, Craig, who's joining us again for another conversation. We'll meet our panelists as well. We'll launch our Zoom poll, our first Zoom poll. Then it will be the discussion followed by the Q&A, and then we'll ask our second Zoom poll towards the end of the evening, and we'll conclude and sign off for the evening. I see already the chat, so many hellos. Welcome everyone for in the Zoom room. Oh my goodness, it's going wild in the chat here. We'll start first things first with our land acknowledgement. So wherever you may be this evening, wherever you may be tuning in from, we also encourage you to do the same. Whose land are you on? So the Art Gallery of Windsor respectively acknowledges that we are located on Anishinaabe territory, the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, comprised of the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And today, the Anishinaabe of the Three Fires Confederacy are represented by Walpole Island First Nation. And we want to state our respect for the historical and ongoing authority of Walpole Island First Nation over its territory. And with that said, we'll jump into our kind of our introduction. You're probably wondering, what does security or surveillance have to do with art, and why is the Art Gallery of Windsor discussing this topic? Well, if we rewind a little bit to 2012, the AGW launched Border Cultures, which was a series of exhibitions that deepened our understanding of what it means to be a border city in the 21st century. And in 2015, we held Border Cultures Part 3, Security Surveillance, which featured artists from across Canada and the world. And Border Cultures was conceptualized first as a research platform that brought together regional, national, and international artists that examined the complex definition of boundaries. And this edition of Border Cultures also examined the impact of heightened security and surveillance along borders. So when we think of security and artists working with surveillance, we think of artists like Julia Shear or Ai Weiwei. So artists have been using this topic for a really long time, and it has inspired their work. So that is why we're here today. It's an important topic in art, and especially today, now more than ever. And for our pillar of creating conversations, we're here to spark community conversations around ideas and issues such as history, culture, and society. And we're using our collection to provoke conversations through our exhibitions and programs and introduce different ways to look at, think about, and make art. We want to activate our collection in ways that make our artworks relevant, accessible, and compelling to audiences. And we're here to inspire artistic innovation by becoming a center for creative, collaborative exploration, and a magnet for inventive makers and thinkers. So we're here to create an open and respectful, supportive space for sharing, learning, and listening. So with that said, if you have questions or comments, please drop them in the chat. We love to hear from folks who are tuning in. If you have a question for our panelists, there will be a Q&A portion towards the end of our Zoom event. Please drop them in the Q&A box. It's just easier for us to keep track of them instead of scrolling through the chat box. So we'll have some time to answer some of your questions. I'll introduce our moderator for this conversation, Craig Pearson. Craig Pearson is the managing editor of the Windsor-Star and a longtime daily journalist and educator. He has worked as a journalist for 35 years and for the last 31 years at the Windsor-Star. The Montreal native has covered arts and entertainment and City Hall and everything in between. He served as a war correspondent in Afghanistan and has won numerous awards, including as a co-winner of the National Newspaper Award Citation of Merit for the Windsor-Star's 2014 gun running series. He has taught journalism part-time at the University of Windsor for 22 years and is the author of 2 From the Vault history books based on Windsor-Star photos. He has hosted many community events and has moderated various panel discussions. Hi, Craig, it's really great to see you. Thank you again for being here. I'll pass the mic over to you to introduce our panelists for this evening. And we'll also do our Zoom poll just before we get into the questions. But I'll let you introduce our panelists this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Sophie. That was a very excellent introduction. You covered all the bases, I think, and I'm happy to be here moderating the Does Surveillance Equal Safety community conversation, which is actually the 3rd community conversation that the Art Gallery of Windsor has hosted. I love the community conversations because they let the art gallery go beyond just the walls of the gallery and also just beyond art as well, although sometimes the community conversations are about art. This one, though, I have to say, security, surveillance, that type of thing is something that comes up in my work as editor of the Windsor-Star a lot. And I must say, we have quite a few people listening in. It tends to be one of those that sort of drums up controversy with it. Not everybody agrees with this question. So I think it's a great one to hold. So I can't wait to hear everybody's opinions on this one. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panelists. We have Reno Borderlin. Reno Borderlin has been the Ward 3 City Councillor in the City of Windsor since 2014, representing the downtown core, where there happen to be quite a few cameras. He's an author, panelist, former business owner of multiple restaurants in the Windsor area. Reno is the current Chair of Development and Heritage Standing Committee, Chair of the Windsor Public Library Board, Chair of the Property Standards Committee, and is a member of both the Windsor Police Services Board and the executive of the Windsor-Essex County Health Unit, acting as Vice Chair. Reno advocates for equity, transparency, strategic city building, and citizen voice. Welcome, Reno. Mita Williams is a librarian at the University of Windsor's Leddy Library and is the head of its Information Services Department. She speaks and writes about civics, feminism, climate change, ranked ballots, and how to imagine better futures. In January of 2020, she helped host a discussion and an evening of speakers who had serious concerns with our mayor's stated goal to have the Windsor Police Service partner with Amazon's Ring network. You should subscribe to her newsletter. And finally, Vincent Manzerol. Vincent Manzerol is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Media, and Film at the University of Windsor. His teaching and research deals with the history, political economy, and theory of media. He has published on a range of topics, including financial technologies, digital marketing and advertising strategies, consumer databases, apps, wireless connectivity, border infrastructure, online audiences, mobile payment systems, and media theory. Thank you, Mita. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Reno, for joining us. And now to our first poll.
All right, so we will be launching the first poll. It should pop up on your screen there. You should be able to submit your votes and cast your votes, pardon me. So the first question is, how concerned are you about surveillance in your everyday life? So 1 being not at all concerned, and number 5 being extremely concerned. The second question, does surveillance support the greater good? This is a single answer, yes or no. And the third question is, should governments be able to track data, such as your location, if the data is anonymous? So either yes or no. We'll give everyone just 1 more minute to cast their votes, and we'll be able to see the results in real time to see where we stand, see what everyone is thinking about. And we'll redo the poll again at the end of the evening to see if your opinion has changed. So we'll just give it a few more seconds here. Excellent. So there, you should see the results up on your screen. Pretty interesting to see. So you can scroll through and see what everyone, where everyone kind of stands, and we'll see if opinions change throughout the evening. So with that said, I'll just fade into the background. I'll pass things over to Craig to moderate the discussion, and I'll be back for the Q&A portion. So thank you again all for being here, and have a great evening.
Well, thanks again, Sophie. And we'll get straight to the questions. And the format we're going to do is I'm going to ask a question and then give all 3 panelists a chance in turn to answer. If they wish to answer, they can also pass, and they won't be docked points or anything like that. So the first question just sort of puts everything into perspectives. What do you think about the proliferation of cameras on buildings, streetlights, people's phones, and more? We'll start with Reno.
Thanks, Craig. For me, it's not really so much as the proliferation of the cameras, but the use of the cameras. So I have a neutral, general perspective. It's really about how far we go with the usage of those cameras, with the footage and what it's being used for. So obviously private entities like your phone or private homes, you can't control what they do, but public cameras, things like that. Like, for example, I've supported on city council traffic cameras and red light cameras because they're very specific to those entities. Something like a red light camera, for example, driving is a privilege, not a right. And so people running red lights, I think it's fine to have something like a camera monitoring that. But I think it's different when it comes into monitoring human activity or just regular residents moving about, which we don't do in this community. But again, for me, it's not necessarily the proliferation of the cameras, but the usage.
And just really quickly on that, how much have you heard from citizens regarding the addition of red light cameras, for instance?
Quite a bit. It was interesting, I think, but a lot of it wasn't necessarily concern of the surveillance. It was more so the fear of ticketing and the fear of getting hefty fines, which tells me they're admitting that they run red lights. So it's an interesting thing, because don't mess with anything that has to do with their automobile or slowing them down in this city, because that's their biggest concern, to be quite honest. But yeah, it was mostly those types of concerns.
Great. Mita, your thoughts on the proliferation of cameras?
I really like this question because it really made me think about the differences between like cameras on your phone and cameras that are on the street. And I was thinking that, if I was out of cream and I wanted to walk to my local convenience store, and someone walked beside me and pulled out a camera and videoed me, I would be creeped out. I would not like that, right? And if it was a police officer in uniform doing the same thing, I would probably feel even worse, even though I'm just going to the convenience store, to get some cream. Now, that being said, when I go to the convenience store, we know that, certain convenience stores used to have break-ins and robberies and those sort of things. So I know that if I walk through that door, there's probably going to be a camera. And I'm kind of okay with that. maybe I shouldn't be, but I'm okay with that. And so I think a lot of it does have to do, I do recognize what Reno said, like a lot of it has to do with the purpose, but a lot of it also has to do with like the placement and what is public and what do we consider public.
Excellent. Okay. Vincent, what are your opening thoughts?
So the proliferation of cameras for me is more kind of a visible representation of, it's a symptomatic of something that's happening, I think, throughout society. There's a belief, I think, or at least in some of the academic literature, that we actually live in a surveillance society now. And the cameras are just the kind of most visible example of that, right? So there have been transformations in the economy and politics and culture and in technology that make it so much easier to surveil each other. There's vertical forms of hierarchical surveillance, and then horizontal in the kind that Mita was mentioning, in terms of you can pull out a camera and surveil somebody else. So it's much more easier. It's much more easy to engage in surveillance now than it ever has been. And so I think it also represents one other feature, which is this idea of kind of surveillance creep. That is, it's not just that there's a static number of cameras. It's that one camera begets two cameras, begets three cameras, and it actually kind of creeps throughout society, right? So for me, it really is, again, kind of symptomatic of the way in which I think our society has embraced surveillance, or at least accepted it in a number of different ways, right? And so yeah, so that's the kind of context that I think about these things through.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I happened to look up mass surveillance on Wikipedia, of all places. And according to Wikipedia, mass surveillance is one of the defining characteristics of an authoritarian society. Interesting. I mean, it goes into much more than that, but that's one of the first things they mention about it. But anyway, before we talk more about it, let's talk about, well, how good of a tool is it? Does it help solve cases? Does it help prevent crime? And we'll start again with Reno.
Well, this was an easy one. It doesn't necessarily prevent crime. It can at times deter it, but statistics show that it doesn't prevent crime, but it absolutely helps solve cases. I mean, that's unequivocal. It's used all the time. So there's those two aspects of it are very different, but at the same time, I think both have been proven over time that the deterrence could be there, but for the most part, statistics show that it doesn't deter. And on the other side, they're always using footage from cameras to solve different crimes that are happening of all natures.
In fact, it's one of the first things that police ask for is their video. Mita, what do you think?
Yeah, I did some research as well, just to find out, and I guess Queen's University has like a CRC chair, Canadian Research Chair, and they've been quoted in the New York Times for saying like the deterrence, the idea that CCTV or closed circuit televisions, they don't help in deterrence at all. They may offset at best, but yeah, they're not acting in terms of deterrence. In terms of evidence, again, I'm not an expert in understanding how the evidence is used, but I think those are the questions as a resident of the city. I think those are the questions that make me think, well, if they're collecting video evidence, how long do they keep it? What are the guidelines for them? Do they run license plate number checks on footage? Do they use facial recognition? Are they going to use AI? Like those sort of questions. So the question is, yeah, if they allow the footage to get into court, yes, then it works. But if the footage doesn't make it, it's not useful.
And Vincent.
Yeah, I agree with Mita. I mean, as far as I can tell, it doesn't really overtly deter crime, but it can be used obviously for evidentiary purposes. But also, I mean, there are other forms of surveillance that might also be a part of solving crimes or deterring crimes. For example, I mean, there's all sorts of social media surveillance that you can engage in, data mining, that kind of stuff. So I think the cameras are probably just one piece of a larger surveillance apparatus if deterring crime is, or solving crimes, let's say more appropriately, is the goal. So it seems like it's perhaps more for the benefit of, insurance liability, that kind of thing than it is for deterring crimes from actually happening.
Well, one question then I would have is, how does it make you feel knowing you're being videotaped, and has it ever changed your behavior? It's something that people might want to think about, especially those, let's say, in public life. Speaking of which, let's start again with Reno.
Well, I mean, I guess it's a couple of different things there. Knowing I'm being videotaped, depending on who. So we also have to be careful, because we've been using the word surveillance. And to your point, Craig, I also looked it up, and it's the active monitoring of behavior. So there is no active monitoring of behavior from the city cameras. When police use something from the city camera, they go afterwards, after a crime potentially has been called in. They will ask for footage from a camera. They have to go through a very thorough process. So there is nobody sitting there, similar to, for example, in the UK, where there are street cameras and police sitting behind those video monitors, actually monitoring for crime. So there is no active surveillance happening. So for me, if I'm walking down the street and I see a camera, I pretend as if it's not there. Now, if somebody walks up next to me and pulls out a phone, of course, because that can do more damage, as we've seen with internet spreading. Things can be edited. Things, I can say 2 sentences and you can take 3 words out of that and spread it, and so it changes things. I think this happens actually quite a bit. I think you see it a lot, whether it's people posting things from public events or things like that, where somebody famous or somebody in the public eye, maybe in a compromised position or something, if you went out and saw someone that was intoxicated or drunk at a bar, you might pull out your phone and take a video. That's the type of that type of video does a lot more damage than any of the street cameras, because the street cameras are not actually being used for surveillance. So for me, it doesn't actually change my behavior. I obviously I'm in a different position. So for me, I have to sort of be cognizant of that behavior across the board, regardless if I'm being videotaped or not. But I think we need to make sure that we're paying attention to the distinction of surveillance and just the presence of cameras versus actively being watched and monitored.
I think that's probably right. And we were talking before the event started about the number of cameras that there are that the city has. And I know you don't know the exact number, but could you just give the listeners an idea of how many? There's recently some more added.
Right. So it was in the news actually coincidentally this week. So there was a grant that was fulfilled last year, but apparently just paid out just this week or last week. So we'll be replacing, I think, 38 old ones and adding up to about 40 new ones. So it's in the 70, 75 range across the city. Most of those are at high traffic intersections. When you look up, if you're at, say Tecumseh and Olette, you'll see them on the poles. And it's mostly, and most of them are there, all of them are there monitoring traffic. They will do things like using real-time information, changing the lights, for example, being able to do things like that. And also, and then of course, they're used afterwards if there's something like a collision or something like that. Red light cameras are a little bit different. They're nuke, and you'll actually see signage as you're driving up to the light, and it's a new white box, probably 30, 40 yards before or after the intersection. And those are just taking photos of your license plate with the timing of the signal. And so there is no personal information there other than whoever is registered to that license plate.
Excellent. Mita, what do you think about knowing you're being videotaped, and do you act any differently?
I always act correctly and properly. So I'm not worried. But I think that's one of the things. I think that's not the largest issue, is how I feel as an individual. I was reading up about the most recent set of cameras that the Ontario government announced, and these cameras were advertised as preventing specifically guns and gang violence. And I think the very first line is, Ontarians deserve to feel safe. and to be safe. And so I think one of the ways that I think about this issue is these cameras spend a lot, they're a lot of money. I think we've spent over almost $500,000, and we already pay 20% of our tax bills to the police services. There's another safety plan that we have in our community. It's the Community Safety and Wellbeing Plan. And that's all the sort of social services. Those are helping housing, addiction services, employment services. And so I think part of it is that it's also what are we not investing in by investing in cameras, right? If we could find housing supports for people who desperately need it, who are underhoused, who are sleeping rough, who are no longer on the streets because they are in a place where they'd rather be and they're safe, I think that's going to make a lot of people actually feel safer than just collecting evidence that maybe you just be gathered just some other way.
Okay, excellent. Vincent, what do you think about being videotaped, as we all are right now?
I feel absolutely fine about it. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions here about, if you're being watched, even if you have done nothing wrong, is that going to alter your behavior? And there's a term in the literature that's called the kind of panoptic effect. That is, like, as soon as you're being watched, there's the assumption that you are going to act differently than if you weren't being watched, or you weren't aware of being watched, right? And this is something I think we learn at a very kind of early age, and perhaps there's a cumulative effect. I mean, if you think about how the story of Santa Claus works, right? It's kind of like inducing this awareness of constantly being watched, so that your behavior is, in line with expectations of the parents. And so I think there is perhaps a sense in which, the presence of cameras might have a cumulative effect in maybe perhaps people self-monitoring or slightly altering their behavior. But I'm not sure if it has like any more kind of nefarious effects to undermine people's overall freedom. But certainly the idea of being watched is just kind of the human kind of condition, is once you are aware that the camera's on, right, you become a different kind of person, right? Or at least that's the idea. So I don't know if there's a definitive answer. I certainly don't mind walking in spaces where there are cameras, and particularly in spaces where I know that the use of the cameras is clear, right? So like, traffic cameras, right? That makes sense because there's a clear use case for them. But having cameras on, just like residential houses and things like that, that's where I think it starts to get a little trickier, and we don't know what the overall kind of cumulative effects of that is going to be. So.
Thanks. Reno, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to circle back because I think, and I think Mita raised a great point, and I'm all for the reallocation of funding, specifically in the way that we create the overall municipal budget with a way too high over focus on police, in my opinion. But we have to also be careful to, the reason for example, for the chief specifically mentioning gangs and gun violence or gun issues is because of our unique location on the border. The reason why Windsor was considered above some of the other municipalities as far as population wise, and the grant was higher, was because of the level of trade of illegal guns that comes from the border. And so when we're talking about tracing that, of course, we want to deal with the root causes of crime and things like that, which always can be stemmed back to inequity and a lot of the social issues that are there. But sometimes for issues like this is bigger issues tied to larger crime conglomerates that are trafficking guns from the US all the way to Toronto, coming through Windsor, through our border, and oftentimes stopping here for a while. And so the cameras are actually traffic cameras, but what we're actually tracing are those license plates of vehicles or trucks that we believe are carrying those guns. So there's a distinguishing characteristic between just having cameras on the streets downtown, which we don't have. They're positioned in places that are monitoring traffic at the same time. And we use them very specifically for those larger investigations where we are tracing vehicles carrying guns. So I think it's important enough to mention, because while I agree with a lot of Mita's points, and I do think we need to start shifting those priorities, something like this is a different type of use of those cameras.
I think it's important to note as well that it's not just the City of Windsor cameras that come into play that police ask for. It's also all the private security cameras that people have. The Windsor Star happens to be, well, for another 3 days or something downtown, and we have been asked by police for footage from our cameras, as have everybody down Olette and anywhere else that there may have been a crime. So it's actually not just the City of Windsor's cameras, but it's a point well taken. And while we're talking about the police, I'd like to ask about something the Chief Pam Mizuno told the Star just this week, and it was a discussion on police body cameras. And she said actually she supports, in theory, police body cameras, though she doesn't feel that the force right now has the $700,000 a year it would cost to implement police body cameras. What are your thoughts about Windsor having police that wear body cameras, starting again with Reno?
Again, I would probably echo those comments in the sense that I would say I have no issue with officers wearing them. The $700,000 figure, I'm not sure if that was the accurate figure, because the amount that came to the board was a lot higher than that. Because, and it's mostly not in the camera hardware itself, but it's in the data residency and the data integrity, and that's the biggest cost. Mm-hmm. And similar to Mita's points, at a time when we're talking about defunding police and lowering the expectations of budgets and things like that, to add another layer of I believe it's millions, especially with the initial purchase. Obviously, the initial purchase would be a capital expense, and then there would be operating after that. And so I find it difficult to justify the expense, but at the same time, this is a situation where if it was an overwhelming support from the public, I'd have no issue bringing that issue forward, both at the board and at council.
What Chief Mizuno said, and I think you're right about the cost, because she only mentioned the operational budget for it. So of course there's the original cost, which I don't know, that's probably where you're getting the million. Also, she did mention, because of cloud storage, the price is coming down. The Association of Chiefs of Police had their meeting last month in Chatham, and they spoke about this issue. And Chatham actually said that they will be moving to body cameras, I believe, with a pilot project.
One more thing,
largely because the cloud storage is letting the price fall a little bit. Anyway.
Right. So if I can add one more thing to that, absolutely. Sorry. And just, we also have to remember that although, I mean, obviously body cameras are there. So, and generally used for monitoring of police actions, or typically to ensure that the police response is adequate, did not go overboard, there was no issues in investigations for things. But we also have to remember that those cameras are on when they're walking into any situation. And so when they're walking into a situation, the situation they're walking into, the people are often having one of the worst days of their lives. And it could be a crime, it could be something, it could be informing a family of something that happened, that their kids were in an accident. It could be a lot of different things, and it could be a lot of different interactions with the public. And so the body cameras that would be on police would just be another version of surveillance cameras, and specifically targeting people in those situations. So you have to see both sides of that as well, because that now, when they walk into those situations, they are now on camera, for better or for worse.
Excellent point. Thank you. Mita, what do you think about police and body cameras?
Yeah, from my reading, my understanding is that in the context of increasing sort of better accountability of police services, that body cameras are not something that has, I guess, the evidence has shown has been useful. And it's not something that those who are really who are activists in the space, that's not what they're advocating for. There are other ways to encourage, the institution to become more accountable to the communities that they serve. And I think there are people who are trying their best to make that happen, but I don't think body cameras are the right investment into that. There's, I think you could invest into some good people to do some sort of cultural change.
Okay. Vincent, what do you think about police and body cameras?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Mita just said. I'll just add one other thing that I think, you know, it can come off as a kind of technological fix. That is, it's kind of like, you know, all you have to do to correct or to build trust or whatever is to give them this new technology. And I think there has to be a lot of other things that also have to go along with it. It can't just be a kind of one solution to solve a complex problem. So I think it has to be part of a lot of other things. And to Reno's point, right, like this, it's a costly investment, and it has legacy costs that, sure, technologies, you know, some of these technologies are declining in cost, but that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the same cost. These are oftentimes private companies that are selling these technologies, and there's all sorts of associated issues that could be related to it. So that's all I would add to that.
Okay, excellent. I mean, I have this feeling that it's only a matter of time that police forces will have body cameras everywhere, just because the technology is there, and because police ask for video, it's almost the first thing they ask for. So I have a feeling it's coming. That's just my guess. I certainly don't know, but it's going to take a while. And I think that that's wise, because, you know, you all just raised some really good points on that, which leads me to my next question is, you know, what about the future? Do you think there are going to be more cameras in the future? What do you think about that? Do you have any cameras that you would like to see removed? Do you have any cameras that you would like to see added? Reno?
Well, I do think we're going to see a continuation of the proliferation of them. Just a few weeks ago, came home from grocery shopping, and the free gift was a camera, and my kids put it up behind a TV just for fun. And when I walked in from work, they were joking and talking to me through the camera. My oldest son ripped it down and was completely against the surveillance issue. So I think you're going to see more and more as these cameras are cheaper, easier. The issues, I think, won't go away. So, for example, do I ever want to see a position like the UK where we're actively monitoring and surveilling people? No. Do I want to see, you know, and even to Mita and Vincent's point about the police, because a lot of this is coming back to police. I think we need a cultural change at how we police and how we do those things, not relying on things like cameras and not encouraging the proliferation of those cameras. I think people will always feel, you know, Mita mentioned, you know, walking into that convenience store, they'll feel safer if there's cameras there, but the reality is it's not any safer. And what it does, it only can help catch them after the fact, but the crime has still happened, the assault has still happened, that trauma is still there. So there's a lot of other things we need to work on the root cause as well before we start counting on camera footage and that type of surveillance to move forward. And I think in general, we may see more of the proliferation, but Vincent sort of touched upon it as well. It's the access and the security of that footage. So regardless, so police have very specific, stringent protocols. They'll call the privacy commissioner. They'll deal with things. There are specific protocols that they have to have. Private individuals don't have that. And so somebody who might have a camera facing out into the wrong direction, who then picks something up on the camera, they're not governed by any specific type of law or even, even common courtesy of sorts. You know, there are certain things like bylaws where you're not allowed to have cameras on your neighbors, for example, but that doesn't apply in general public. And you see it all the time, kids who whip out the camera at a concert and they have 50,000 people on film. And so on video. So I do see the proliferation, but I think we need to look at it, you know, it's going to happen, but I think it should happen for leisure or for novelty, not for things like surveillance or crime deterrence or things like that, because at the end of the day, you're just slapping Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid on a solution, as opposed to dealing with the root causes and changing the culture and the way we police, as opposed to just improving the technology, as Vincent pointed out.
Thanks a lot. Mita, what do you think about the future and cameras?
I think there's no historical inevitability. I think that's something that's really we have to be reminded of. It feels like sometimes that there is a momentum, but that momentum can be that momentum can be stemmed properly. There's already a tremendous amount of surveillance that we go through, not so much with cameras are one part of it, but it's that invisible surveillance that we don't quite understand, right? There's a whole unregulated business of data brokers, for example, that buy and sell, and they mismatch data from locations, and some of the data is garbage and some of it is absolutely spot on. And so we always are playing catch up with our privacy commissioners and our regulatory and our politicians. And I think that's something that has to continue. And I think we need to, we have some very strong privacy advocates in government, and I hope that we can lend them some more influence and power, because there's I don't think there's not an appetite for this. People don't want to be surveilled. If it's anything to see with my own children, the public, this younger generation is not so keen on being on Facebook or on Instagram. There's a shift offline, and this idea that surveillance equals safety doesn't really jive with the fact that, you know, 2 years ago, we had some of the largest world protests around the world after George Floyd. This idea of public trust has been largely eroded in so many of our institutions. And so, yes, cameras are everywhere, but that idea that this makes us safer is I think going to be strongly contested. I think it's strongly contested now. We don't like it. We don't want more of it. Do not want.
You said two things that were interesting. Well, one is the George Floyd killing, of course, could not have created this movement around the world had it not been filmed. So, and now that was not surveillance footage, that was bystanders who took that one. And the other one that tweaked me is you said that young people are starting to not want to be on social?
In their own social. So in their own social.
Oh.
So they are social, but they're in they're in Discord. I know that it depends. There's, for everything I say, there's a massive contradiction of TikTok and other things. So I'm just saying that there is a, we're recognizing that there are sort of our harms of living in a public, and this idea of how many people want to have their most embarrassing moments turned into likes. You know, I have friends like we're trying to get cultural responses to that. What is the cultural response of a bunch of friends who are just being goofy? And if somebody brings out a phone, they might get chastised.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Vincent, what do you think about the future in cameras?
Yeah, I think Mita covered quite a bit of it. I'll just add a few other things to what she said. First of all, the issue of the cameras, as I was trying to kind of mention earlier, is really just like the most visible part of the larger surveillance apparatus. I mean, there's so much of what we would call surveillance, which is invisible to us, which I think that's the part that's the harder thing to kind of get a grasp on. And that's why we do need kind of privacy first advocates and technologies and policies and so on. The other aspect that kind of concerns me is the automation of surveillance. So that's a part of it as well. So Reno was mentioning, in the UK, you have people that are actually stationed watching cameras. There's actually a great documentary. I can't remember the name of it, but you can find it on YouTube that actually is like kind of a weird ethnography of people who do that, who work for those companies. But I think increasingly it's, surveillance is automated, whether it's video cameras or not. So you have algorithms and facial recognition technologies that might trigger a form of surveillance. And so the question then is, where's the accountability? Where's the transparency? All those related issues. And then, of course, there's the cultural aspect that there's some glimmers of optimism from Mita, which I really like to hear, because it seems like, at least for the last, say, 15, 20 years, right, there has been a cultural value to being visible, to being seen, to having yourself surveilled. And, you know, we see that now with the rise of influencers and, you know, pick your social medium of choice, right? So, and I hope that there is a pushback to that, because I do think that, you know, the movement towards, you know, having your entire life kind of being fine, kind of having it documented and shared, and that there's actual kind of value to that, I think that can have a pernicious effect in the long term. So, and finally, you know, I mean, a lot of this issues related to safety have to do with perceptions of safety, right? So a lot of this has to do with the way that we construct the world through what we see through the media. So if we see the world as a mean place with lots of crime, where you know, we're at risk every time we leave our houses, then there's going to be an appetite for more surveillance, right? So that kind of culture of fear and kind of risk aversion, I think that's another element that is a part of this as well. So I hope those kind of cultural trends kind of reverse a bit, and that there is an actual appetite to rein in both the visible and invisible aspects of surveillance that seem to be permeating everything.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about having the image of society. Does it seem less safe than it is, and what effect does that have? And on that note, I believe that Reno touched on this. Actually, you've all touched on it a bit, but what civil liberty issues are at stake, if any, with increased surveillance? And starting as always with Reno.
Well, same thing. I mean, using it and using it preemptively, you know, obviously things like, you know, the video version of carding, let's say, where you're preemptively assuming, or the assumption is made. And that's what I think comes from active surveillance. And again, I just want to reiterate, that's not what we have in Windsor, but I think the slippery slope could get there in different areas. And I think somewhere like, you know, that active space, like in the UK as well, I think we've almost agreed to, you know, to Mita's point, where there is the more of that surveillance aside just from being on camera. But when we start to use that data to start to almost make predictive assumptions and constantly start to go in that direction, I think you get to a point where it's a dangerous precedent. And I think that needs to be very carefully analyzed. I mean, it's one thing to use data post and to do a very thorough analysis of it, and it's different than cherry picking a couple units of data, you know, using it to follow people's mobility or something like that, and then making assumptions that are dangerous. And so I think that's the main concern that I see of it. And I think it's something that I think it can be controlled, but I think we're already dipping our toe in it in a lot of different ways, and not necessarily just from police, but also how different companies use that data, even in our social media platforms. And so I think you see a lot of dangerous use of that constantly in political forums and political parties and organizing for events. We've seen a lot of the discussion around the truck convoy this weekend, and how they've used the data collection of thousands of people across the country to organize this event. And so what you're pulling and then how you're using that data then starts to get a little bit dangerous at times. So again, the use and the slippery slope. And I think that from the higher levels, we have that general sort of self-awareness, but I think in general as a community, we jump to conclusions because we have so much data accessible to us at our fingertips that we don't know how to really analyze that data to make good conclusions, and we jump to those conclusions all too often.
Thank you. Mita, what civil liberty issues do you see?
I see kind of like a sort of a kind of broadly, a broad way and a specific way of thinking about it. I think in the broad way is this idea of like a sort of like at the institution level. Like, so for example, I think it was last year, you know, reporting found out that this city of Windsor's police were using a very problematic Clearview artificial intelligence facial recognition. And the only reason why we knew about it was that the privacy commissioner asked all the police services Originally, they didn't answer, and then they did answer that they were using it, and then they stopped using it. And so we're policy-wise, we have to figure out as a community, and there are cities, Detroit has a huge surveillance network, and there are activists who are actively trying to dismantle it because it's causing harm in their community. And there are places like San Francisco that are trying to ban facial recognition. I think in Montreal, they're trying to do that too. So as communities, how do we come up with these sort of solutions? Because what we're talking about cameras, we need a community solution. So like there's a wonderful activist across, Chris Gillard, who's a community college professor. He's a writer, he's an activist in this space, and he tells this really great story about how he lives in a Detroit neighborhood and somebody egged his car. It's probably a kid, maybe a couple of kids. And so while he's cleaning his car, his neighbor comes up and says, hey, I've got footage. I got footage on my camera. Do you want me to send it to the police? And he's like, I don't want to get the police involved and have some sort of potential escalation when I can just solve this problem with vinegar and some soap and water. And so we need to be able to, as communities, figure out what we have to take some degree of ownership of. How do we take care of like the weakest people? How do we recognize that kids make mistakes? And what do we do about inconsequential crime? Just, ridiculous things, because that happens. And we just because we have footage of it doesn't mean that much more.
Thank you. Vincent, what do you think? Are there any civil liberty issues at stake here?
Well, I mean, one of the issues that just for thinking about surveillance in the most totalizing way, I mean, not just cameras, but all sorts of other ways that we're being surveilled. I think it was Neil Richardson wrote a piece or an excerpt from a book that he wrote recently about the ethics of predictive technologies, right? And if we claim to be or aspire to be, let's say, a free society, or society in which we value the autonomy of the individual, the ability for people to make their own choices, then what does it mean to live, or to potentially live, in a society where all of your actions and moves can not only be tracked, but be predicted and anticipated and so on? And that might seem like sci-fi, but we're already starting to see kind of hyper personalization start to kind of permeate all of our digital technologies, and this might again kind of migrate to the real world. And so I think there is a kind of ethical dimension to thinking about, if this seemingly intractable march towards ubiquitous surveillance continues, I mean, what is the future of personal autonomy, freedom, the sovereignty of the individual? And I think those are questions that can't necessarily just be solved with discussions of privacy. So I think there is a bigger kind of cultural conversation or community conversation that needs to happen around that. But I do think at the same time, privacy needs to be rethought or reconceptualized. I mean, privacy not just as a right, but as a cultural value. I think that's the thing that is actually kind of missing to a certain extent. And it's been very beneficial for a lot of the biggest tech companies, right? Because it's not as though they don't necessarily have privacy policies and so on. I mean, oftentimes they don't follow them, but those are in place. But I think there's a wager that they make on three things from users and consumers and just regular people, is that people will be ignorant to the power of surveillance or their ability to collect information. They're indifferent, even if they know that it's there, or they're seduced by the conveniences and other kind of features that you get by giving up your privacy. And so I think that's kind of where we're at now. And I don't know what the way to fix that is. It's probably, obviously, as many things, a complex solution, but I think kind of rethinking what privacy means as a cultural value, in addition to it being a right or something that we need to kind of enshrine in legislation. So that's what I would say about that.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'd like to turn now to some questions from the audience. We have quite a lively chat going on here. And one question here is, hello, I'm wondering if someone can address the impact of police or government surveillance on racialized people and women in particular. I don't know if anybody would like to start with that one. Could we start with you, Reno, unless anybody wants to jump ahead of you?
Well, again, I'll reiterate my position. There's no way, I mean, I would consider myself anywhere near close to an expert to make a global comment on that. But again, just to reiterate what I said earlier, is that in Windsor, and I'm just speaking for Windsor, is that there is no police or government surveillance of anybody, much less racialized group or women or any targeted. It's literally only for investigative issues tied to a very specific crime. And as Mita mentioned as well, that then the threshold for using that in court is also very high. And so it's only as a response post-crime. There is no surveillance in that same, in watching from either a government or a police angle. As far as the impacts of it on a global level, again, I don't feel prepared to answer that question, as far as definitely not knowledgeable enough to make any comments on that on a global level.
Fair enough. Mita, did you have any thoughts on the effect of surveillance, in particular on racialized people or women?
Yeah, I think I do. I think one of the ways that we can understand when we think about technology is just a really broad stroke question of, is this uphold the status quo, or does this threaten the status quo? Does it share power, or does it concentrate power, right? And I think we know that this isn't an equalizer. And this isn't a particular set of surveillance doesn't generally make the lives of people who are already at risk any less riskier, unless unless we believe that it actually is going to resolve crime in a way herefore that we've never figured out before. We have longstanding issues. There was an article from Toronto journalist Desmond Cole. He lives in Toronto. He had been stopped by police 50 times because of carding, and because of the work of activists and scholars, all these people to stop that practice. I went to a ward meeting, I think it was, and where literally a police officer had suggested that, call if there's somebody in your neighborhood that makes you, that looks suspicious. Because we can't card anymore. But if you call and you say that somebody looks suspicious, then let us know, because then we can then we can have an interaction. And so when we're talking about surveillance, we have to ask these questions about who feels, when does a person feel like they belong to a neighborhood? And we know that I watched the mayor's panel, and there was a gentleman in our neighborhood who had police called on him because, he was in Walkerville and he was at his home, but he looked suspicious to his neighbors because he was a Black Canadian. So those are the larger, thornier issues. Those are issues of justice. And I think those are issues that we're working on. We have lots of people who are trying to work on it and to make it better, and investing in, again, but we're not investing in people. If we're investing in machines, that's not going to get us closer to the city that we want.
Thank you. Vincent?
Yeah, I think Mita captured a lot of it perfectly. I'll just add that, surveillance is a type of policing, right? Like policing, and I don't mean the police force per se, but in terms of policing as in like figuring out what doesn't belong or identifying or containing risks. And I think that the spread of or the practices associated with some of the things that we've talked about really do end up disproportionately being targeted at marginalized groups or individuals who might be identified as outside of the norm. So for example, the proliferation of ring cameras, right, by communities, right? So where it becomes, and you can actually surveil your neighborhood and identify when somebody walks in the neighborhood that doesn't belong. Now, however you want to define that is gonna change based on where you are, but I think there is a documented risk to marginalized groups across, not just in Canada, but elsewhere, who are targeted by whether it's police surveillance or other types of community surveillance. And so I really do think that that's another one of the ethical dimensions of thinking about, what is the impact of surveillance? And I ask my students, do they care about surveillance? A lot of them say no, or, I've got nothing to hide, but that typically reflects a kind of, that will demonstrate kind of where you are in society in terms of your position relative to what is considered to be normal or part of the community and so on. So I think surveillance is really one of the ways that or one of the areas that needs to be addressed as part of a larger kind of engagement with social inequality more generally.
Thanks. Reno, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back on just a couple of points because I think it's important. And I find myself doing this a lot, especially since joining the police board, is that when we look at issues of police response, and I think Mita raised it, where people call the police because somebody looks suspicious in the neighborhood. Police respond to all the calls for service. And unfortunately, they've now become the first responders for most social issues in our community. And so they are now tasked with trying to figure out how to do things. So that the comment about, at a ward meeting saying call to put in a complaint, those are real issues that residents are dealing with. And these are issues that I hear about every single day. And I'll give you one real life example. A woman comes out on her porch and somebody may be passed out from a drug overdose or passed out because they had been sleeping on the porch, or they may be sleeping on the neighbor's porch. And if they call the police can't do anything because the homeowner has to say that they are trespassing. Because of carding rules, they are not able to approach the individual, but the people don't feel safe. And the person could be acting erratic, could be having a mental health episode. And police are the people who are called. So this is one of the problems, is that things end up landing on police all too often. And so then how and what they have the tools at their fingertips, for example, of calling in that complaint or something like that. Some of these are real complaints. Some of these are people who may be breaking into sheds all the way down the street. And so they have to treat every call as a real call. And I think Mita, by stating that, actually gets to some of the root issues, is are people's willingness to just look to police to solve all those problems. And I think that's one of the problems that we have. And whether it be the egg on the car or whether it be an unruly neighbor, I mean, I can tell you a lot of weird, messed up stories of people calling police for the most ridiculous, frivolous, crazy things. But we've used police as the answer. And then when police respond and they're not perfect, then it gets attributed and sort of tagged onto them. And so we need to be careful about that, because this is the general public who's calling the police on their neighbors or on the neighbor or the person 3 houses down that looks suspicious in their neighborhood. So it's not the police responding to that. And I say that with respect to say that that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And some of those things and things like racial profiling don't exist. But there are a lot of things, and statistically, the Windsor force that is not the same as, say, the Toronto force and things like that, that happen through carding. And so when we talk about how police respond to these things, we need to be careful, because they're responding to what the public called for. And that's one of the issues. And we as a society have decided that police are there to take care of issues tied to mental health, addictions, homelessness, and all the social issues we've refused to fund over the last 40 years are now at the feet of police. So I just wanted to put that out there, because sometimes the rhetoric gets a little too far at times.
Thanks a lot. This one's actually not really a question, but it's in the Q&A list, so I'll just read it. But Emmett Till's mother, Mammy, would disagree we needed surveillance to have a George Floyd moment. So somebody who's just pointing out that you don't necessarily need the footage. What you need is the willpower and people rising up. I don't know if anybody wants to address that. Like, it wasn't a question exactly, but I think it's a good point. Another question we have, this one says it's a question for Reno specifically. What are the other concerns does Windsor Police and the public have for body cameras, along with, it's moving around here as I'm trying to read it, that the public have for body cameras, along with, are there any investments in de-escalation training?
There are investments in de-escalation training, not enough. There are also investments in recruitment. A lot of new officers these days are actually coming from programs like social work and more human-focused sort of disciplines. Not enough, in my opinion. I think we should be shifting resources to better recruitment, better training. I think the de-escalation has definitely increased, and the attention to that has increased. But at the same time, I don't think any police officer is properly prepared to deal with some of the acute issues that they walk into. They can attempt to de-escalate a situation, but we need to be working with other agencies and other partners, which we have started doing. We have a memorandum of understanding where we have mental health workers now on the front lines. We have a great relationship with outreach workers especially in our downtown area, but across the city. So there are movements in the right direction. Is it enough? No. Will it be enough over the next 20 years? No. It's until we decide to make a hefty investment into mental health supports and addiction supports and homelessness so that it reduces the workload towards what police should be investigating as violent crime, it won't ever be enough. They are the wrong people to be responding to this. And even police officers and chiefs will say that. And so it needs to be overinvested in for a long time to make up for 40 years of disinvestment. And some of that, yes, lies with de-escalation training, but it needs to go way beyond that.
And one quick question, I think this one's aimed at you as well, is has Windsor developed a partnership with Amazon Ring?
No.
Excellent, thank you. And here we're starting to run out of time because this is scheduled till 8:15. So I'm going to ask one last question, rolling a few in because there's been a few that are along this lines. But what are your thoughts on COVID-19 mobile phone applications tracking the movement of millions of users without their knowledge, and as well, sort of the same one, there are people talking about Tesla and other high-tech cars that are tracking everything, how fast you're going, you're turning on stoplights without stopping, those kinds of things. So what do you think about those? Are not just cameras, but it's more electronic tracking. Anyway, I guess we could start with Reno and we can go to the other.
This is a tricky one because I know that there can be benefits, and I can say that the city of Windsor used, I forget exactly, but I think it was cell phone data in their transit master plan configuration to figure out where people were moving in the community to design our transit routes around that. That was anonymous data, and it was just simply basically a map with heat zone, so to speak. But so I think there can be benefits. I think we got one of the best outcomes of a master plan that we have seen because of the help of that data. It literally told us where people were moving about in the community. Now, again, the slippery slope of and Vincent's comment about the predictive data and then using that to determine or predetermine things is the concern in the slippery slope. And so I don't know what that answer is. I mean, checks and balances and making sure there are policies and laws and regulations all along are important. But I have to say that I see the benefits of those. When I see the types of improvements in vehicles that can lead to less automobile accidents. It's one of the largest causes of death across North America are automobile accidents. So if we're reducing that because of some of these technologies, it's the weighing the benefits versus what we're accepting at that point. To how Vincent put it was, what level are we willing to accept for the offset of the good? And so I think it can be good. It still needs to be heavy regulated. And so it's one of those things that when you go into, Windsor talks about automobility all the time. We talk about, innovation and all these things. We often forget about the security and the privacy factors, right? And so those are footnotes that sometimes are added only after, but we need to include that as part of the discussion from day one and make sure that every decision along the way has privacy and security kept in mind.
Thanks very much. Mita, so what are your thoughts on the apps, the COVID apps, all the other types of non-video technology? And as one audience member said, the growing threat of surveillance capitalism and the use of all the personal information.
So I think just to clarify, so from my understanding, the question answer is referring to the fact that the federal government or an agency at the federal government purchased from a data for good program from TELUS, localization data. That's separate from my understanding of the app. And the way that I think, I'm a huge fan of public health, and I think the public health is it is a forum. It's an institution that has long had to balance these sort of pressures of public health surveillance and privacy. And they are an institution that has made, obviously they will make mistakes, but I think they've done an exceptional job. I think locally they've done exceptionally, and as I said, as a sort of profession, that value is built into their profession. I'm a librarian. Privacy is built into our professional values. The Leddy Library has 5 values that it reconfirmed. One of them is privacy. For all the miracles that our beloved IT professionals and systems have, their work is not grounded in values. And that's something that I think that profession needs to work on. And I think that's something that still can be developed. I actually keep a folder of all the technology critics. This is, why can't IT people be more like librarians? So I think the answer is we just need more librarians. Yeah. That's my answer to most questions.
It's an excellent answer.
Thank you.
Vincent, you can sort of wrap it up. What are your thoughts on all the extra types of technology that are tracking us and this so-called surveillance capitalism?
I'll second more librarians. I have an affinity for librarians as advocates for public good, social good, and so on. But I think, if we're talking about these mass data sets like pandemic surveillance, like public health actually does surveillance reports. They've been doing it for years on the spread of all sorts of diseases. And so this speaks to a larger issue of like the term surveillance we often associate with a very particular, like George Orwell, 1984. If it's surveillance, it's obviously bad. But actually surveillance is helpful to do a lot of things that we want to do, right? Public health being one of them. Managing traffic as another, public transit. I mean, and it would be really regrettable if all of that really good data that a company like TELUS has wasn't available to be used for the public good in a way that I think it could be if there are all the kind of security protections, transparency, and all that kind of stuff. So I think there is actually quite a value in having certain types of mass surveillance, provided that the context and the application is clear and there's transparency and oversight and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that we should, immediately dismiss government surveillance or just the term surveillance. But I do think that it has to come with all of those kind of caveats associated with it. And just on the term, surveillance capitalism, right? It speaks to something that, again, cell phone companies, technology companies, right? The idea that one of the main drivers of profitability is people's data is actually surveillance, right? And I think that's kind of the flip side. And I think that still needs to be, there still needs to be a reckoning with that kind of profit motive that is driving the mass kind of collection of personal data, which is filtering and feeding into the stuff I talked about earlier, right? Like the idea that we're moving into a hyper-personalized future where our various technologies and platforms kind of know us better than we do, and there's this lack of transparency. And there's a power dimension to that too, because if you just think about just regular social relationships, if you know something about somebody else and they don't, and you don't, like, they don't know that, that gives you a kind of power, right? That can be a tool of manipulation. So I think that's the other side of it, that we're still kind of reckoning with the effects and how to rein that in, because personal data surveillance is very profitable, but it has the potential to really do something for public good, right, in a mass transformative way. So
we just have to have the right willpower to make it go the right direction. I can be used bad, but I think your point is We could use it for good. Let's hope that we do. I'd like to thank, before I pass it off to Sophie, I'd like to thank Reno Borderlin, Mita Williams, and Vincent Manzerol. Thank you very much for a fabulous discussion with a rock solid audience going through the chat, putting it on fire. Thanks so much. Back to you, Sophie.
Thank you so much, everyone. Just to echo what Craig just said, the chat has been on fire this evening. This is an incredible discussion. Lots of love for librarians I see in the chat as well. So go librarians. We need more librarians and we need more artists as well. This was such a thought-provoking and thoughtful conversation. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to Craig for moderating the conversation. At this time, we're going to launch our second Zoom poll. They're the same questions that we answered at the beginning, but we're interested in seeing if your opinions have changed after we've asked those tough questions, after we've discussed in the chat and during the conversation. We want to see if your opinions have changed. So we'll give it just a couple of more seconds to see what we all think here in the Zoom room. Just a few more seconds, and we'll get to see if the results have changed. This is always my favorite part of our community conversations. Excellent. And there you go. And we should see on the screen, it has changed quite a bit, I must say. So it's really interesting to see what everyone has thought and shared, not only in the chat, but with the poll as well. Before we close off our event this evening, I'll just share my screen again. But the Art Gallery of Windsor hosts these community conversations, but it doesn't end here. We want to keep this going, keep this energy up. So let's keep the conversation going. You can find us online at agw.ca. You can follow us on social media as well at AGW401. We love talking about art and talking about important subjects and topics that are affecting our communities. And we do that through art. And it's really interesting when we all come together and have these discussions. I'll also mention, I know we're still closed. We hope to reopen very, very soon in February, but you can get your membership to come and visit the gallery as much as you'd like. So we have free membership for artists and we have free memberships for youth under 25. So some really great memberships available at the Art Gallery of Windsor. We're planning some really great programs and exhibitions in 2022. And like I said, we're going to keep this conversation going, right? We love talking and discussing about important issues in our communities. So with that said, once again, I'd like to thank Craig, our moderator, Mita, Vincent, and Reno, our panelists, for this amazing discussion, everyone in the chat. And we'll conclude our evening here. Thank you again, everyone, and take good care and stay safe.